Good evening. Tens of thousands of people have taken part in a further day of anti-racism protests in the UK, with the statue of a 17th century slave trader pulled down in Bristol. The monument to Edward Colston, which had stood in the city centre since 1895, was then pushed into the river. The latest demonstrations came 12 days after the killing of George Floyd by US police, and despite the government advising people not to take part because of the risk of catching or spreading coronavirus. Our correspondent Chichi Azundu reports.
The statue of Edward Colston, a 17th century slave trader. Erected in Bristol city centre since 1895, it had been the subject of a petition to have it removed. But this is where protesters left it. Police say they're now investigating the criminal damage of the statue of the man estimated to have bought and sold 80,000 people.
It represents years of hurt and just a lot of emotion and hatred that has been built up inside of us. We've internalised for years, and that coming down today hopefully signifies change.
The demonstrations around the UK have been largely peaceful. In Glasgow, protesters tried to maintain a 2-metre distance from each other.
I think the turnout's amazing, it's really inspiring, and it's amazing to see people already taking social distancing measures seriously and doing the best they can to stay safe today.
After a week of protests, thousands more have decided to take to the streets across cities in the UK. But in London, they've decided to make the US Embassy their focus.
Being black is not a crime! Being black is not a crime! Being black is not a crime!
I'm from Oakland, California, so I grew up with a lot of police violence around me, and it's something I don't want my son to experience in his life, so that's one of the reasons why I'm in this country, because it is less violent, but there's still racism, so we have to fight it, so therefore we're here today.
14 police officers were injured as last night's protests came to an end outside Downing Street. The government once again reminded people right now, meeting more than 6 is breaking the rules.
It is shameful, and quite frankly, that is why these protests should stop and they should not go ahead, and people must be mindful and stick with the rules that have been put in place.
Just like the US, the protests in the UK feel like they're gathering momentum. Strength of feeling hasn't yet diminished, and those wanting to add their voice is growing. Chichi Azundu, BBC News.
Let's go live now to Bristol, where John Kay is at the site of the statue that was toppled. John, how significant a figure was Edward Colston for the city?
Well, Edward Colston's statue had pride of place on that plinth. And not just the statue itself. This is Colston Avenue. There are schools named after him. There's a concert hall named after him. For centuries, he was celebrated in Bristol as a politician, as a philanthropist, as a businessman. But the last few decades, there has been a growing campaign to make sure that his role in the slave trade was properly reflected and remembered. And I think what's happened here this afternoon was that years of frustration were taken out on that bronze statue that used to stand on the plinth behind me. One young black Bristolian woman told me she felt an enormous sense of relief. She said, I can finally walk past here and feel I belong here. I feel that Bristol is my city. But in the last few minutes, we've had a very small counter demonstration just up the road with people saying that they felt that their local history had been trashed. Avon and Somerset Police have defended the way they operated this afternoon. They said that they did everything they could safely, and that if they'd intervened, it just would have risked the whole operation. Michelle.
John Kay in Bristol. Thank you. The young organisers of today's protests have told the BBC that they are the generation to bring about real change. Since the killing of George Floyd 12 days ago, the hashtag Black Lives Matter has been used 40 million times on social media. And many people have shared and listened to experiences of racism. Our community affairs correspondent Rihanna Croxford reports.
We're all black and we need to stand together. I don't want my children to have to do the same thing that I'm doing right now.
We, the bereaved families that are left behind, are the voices of the cemetery.
They are 4 decades apart, united by the same battle against racism. Natasha is 21 and just a student. But today, she and her friend Ima have brought together thousands of people across the UK to protest over the death of African-American George Floyd.
You can't really tell the oppressed how to feel. because we're the ones who are experiencing it. Just because people aren't like out on the street like pointing at me and calling me the N-word doesn't mean that like racism isn't still alive.
What would you say to people who criticise the lack of social distancing at these protests?
We have a health pandemic happening right now. I don't want people to be affected, but at the same time we have another pandemic of black people being killed and shot every single day, and no one's talking about it, no one's fighting about it. So I think that we need to fight both of these.
This isn't the first time people in the UK have taken to the streets to protest. The Brixton riots in 1995, the London riots in 2011, and the protests today have all been triggered by the deaths of a black person in police custody. These are the faces of some of the people who have died. An uncomfortable history, some say it's now time for the nation to confront.
It's sunk in and then it doesn't sink in, and then it's sunk in and then it...
Stephanie Lightfoot Bennett is still fighting for justice for her brother Leon, who died in police custody in 1992. His case was reopened in November last year.
When Leon died, it was nothing, you know, and now we have this movement where any death is now highlighted. And students, I love students. They are the future, they are the eyes, and they are the ones that will help shut the door. Not completely, but shut the door on racism.
As yet another generation take to the streets, these organisers say they won't stop till those in power start to listen. Rhianna Croxford, BBC News.
Thousands of anti-racism protesters have taken to the streets again this weekend, despite warnings to avoid large gatherings. Demonstrators gathered outside the American embassy and chanted for justice following the death of George Floyd. Will Davis reports.
For the second day in a row, thousands of protesters peacefully marched through the capital. They then fell silent, taking a knee outside the US Embassy to protest the death of George Floyd in America, despite this demonstration breaking strict lockdown rules.
We have no choice. That's how I feel. Coronavirus has been around for a few months. This has been around 400 years, do you know what I mean?
And I really hope this will encourage more people who are implicit in the system to sit up and listen and do something.
No sign of trouble today, but last night there were confrontations between police and protesters. 14 police were injured and 29 people were arrested. The protests haven't just been taking place in central London. Last night, heavyweight boxing champion Anthony Joshua lent his support to a smaller rally in Watford.
The virus has been declared a pandemic. It is out of control. And I'm not actually talking about COVID-19. The virus I'm referring to is called racism.
As the police and government urge people to stay home, those on the march say they'll keep going until their voices are heard. Will Davies, ITV News.